There are moments in history that don't make sense until you zoom out, and this is one of them. August 1985. American dealerships are packed. Ronald Reagan is in the White House. The economy is humming. And on the showroom floor, sitting between a Chevrolet and a Ford, is something no one expected. A brand new car with a sticker price of $3,990. Not used, not rebuilt, not a stripped-down kit, brand new. The cheapest new car ever sold in the United States at that point in history. It was called the Yugo, and it came from a country most Americans had never seriously thought about, Yugoslavia. Now, before you write this off as a quirky car story, stop right there, because what you're about to hear isn't really about a car. It's about what happens when a government decides that one single vehicle will represent an entire nation, when ideology sits in the driver's seat, and when 40,000 working people pour their lives into a machine that the rest of the world will eventually turn into a punchline. This is a story about control, about pride, about the brutal gap between what a country wants to be and what it actually is, and it starts long before the Yugo ever rolled off the assembly line. Yugoslavia, in the early 1980s, was unlike any country in the world. It wasn't a Soviet satellite. It wasn't Western. It occupied a strange, tense middle ground, socialist in structure, but fiercely independent in identity. Marshal Josip Broz Tito had held the whole thing together for decades through sheer force of personality and political cunning. He defied Stalin in 1948, built relationships with both East and West without surrendering to either. He created something genuinely original, a version of socialism built around workers' self-management. The idea that ordinary people, not distant party officials, would run their own factories, make the decisions, control the output. It sounded revolutionary. In some ways, it genuinely was. But in May of 1980, Tito died, and without him, the fault lines beneath Yugoslavia's surface began cracking wide open. No single leader could command the loyalty he had. The rotating presidency that replaced him satisfied no one. Inflation started climbing, then accelerating. By the late 1980s, it would breach 1,000% annually. Regional tensions between Yugoslavia's 6 republics were intensifying. The country was moving fast and not in a good direction. And somewhere in the middle of all that pressure, in the industrial city of Kragujevac, in central Serbia, a factory was being asked to carry the weight of a nation's pride. What nobody told those workers was how heavy that was going to get. And what nobody told the world was how far that little car would travel before the whole thing came crashing down. The city of Kragujevac had been making things long before it made cars. It was Serbia's first modern industrial city, home to an arms factory dating back to the 19th century. It knew discipline. It knew what it meant to produce something under pressure. In 1953, the Zastava factory, its name means flag in Serbian, signed a licensing agreement with Fiat. They would build Italian-designed cars on Serbian soil. Yugoslavia needed vehicles. Fiat needed a partner willing to operate within a socialist economy. The deal made sense for both sides. For over 20 years, Zastava produced licensed Fiat models, the Fiat 601, the Fiat 128. Yugoslav workers learned the craft. The factory expanded. By the late 1970s, Kragujevac was a proper automotive city. Factories, supplier plants, family homes built entirely on the wages of people who built cars for a living. But the leadership in Belgrade had bigger ambitions. Licensing, Fiat, designs, was fine for a start. But it kept Yugoslavia dependent. And dependency on anyone, East or West, went against everything Tito had built. The decision was made. Yugoslavia would develop its own car. Not from scratch. The new model would draw on the platform of the Fiat 127, a proven, practical, lightweight small car, but it would be branded as Yugoslav. Built by Yugoslav hands, sold under a Yugoslav name. The result was the Yugo 45, named simply for its engine output, 45 horsepower, a 903 cubic centimeter engine, a curb weight of under 750 kilograms, a top speed of around 130 kilometers per hour. It was never going to win any races. It was never meant to. It was meant to be accessible, affordable, democratic in the most literal sense, a car that a factory worker, a teacher, a nurse could actually own. Production officially began in 1980. And in the beginning, there was genuine pride inside that factory. Workers were building something that belonged to them, to their country, to their future. But pride and precision are not the same thing. And that distinction was about to become very expensive. The problem wasn't the fundamental design. The problem was what happened between the blueprint and the finished vehicle. And to understand that, you need to understand how the factory actually worked, because what went on inside those walls was something no business school in the West would have believed. Workers' self-management sounded like a worker's paradise on paper. Every employee had a voice. Factory councils made production decisions. Wages were tied to collective output. On the surface, it was the most humane industrial model ever attempted. In practice, it created a system where no one was truly accountable. If a car came off the line with a fault, a misaligned door, a seal that didn't hold, an electrical connection that was loose, stopping the line meant reducing output. Reducing output affected collective wages. Affecting wages made you unpopular with your colleagues. So faults got passed along. Problems got shipped out. Quality control existed on paper. In reality, it was quietly negotiated away by the pressure of social dynamics and production targets. These weren't careless workers. They were skilled, dedicated people caught inside a system that rewarded volume over everything else. Volume won, every time. By the early 1980s, Zastava was producing tens of thousands of cars per year. The Yugo 45 was selling inside Yugoslavia, at prices ordinary citizens could actually afford. On that measure, it was a genuine success. Working-class families who had never owned a car were driving one. That was real. That mattered. But outside Yugoslavia's borders, the reputation was a different story. And one man on the other side of the Atlantic had spotted an opportunity that everyone else had overlooked. His name was Malcolm Bricklin. If that name means anything to you, it's probably because he was also the man who brought Subaru to America in the late 1960s. Bricklin had a particular talent, not for engineering, but for seeing value where others saw nothing. He could spot a gap in a market and walk straight through it. In 1984, Bricklin traveled to Yugoslavia, toured the Zastava plant, and made a proposition. He would import the Yugo to the United States and sell it as the most affordable new car in America. Yugoslavia, desperate for hard Western currency to service its mounting foreign debt, agreed. The deal was signed. The cars were modified to meet American safety and emission standards. And in the summer of 1985, the Yugo arrived in the United States with a price tag that made headlines from coast to coast. $3,990, brand new, with a warranty. The press couldn't believe it, the public couldn't ignore it, and for one brief, shining moment, it actually worked. The launch of the Yugo in the United States in August of 1985 was, by any measure, a genuine cultural event. Dealers reported crowds, phone lines were jammed, automotive journalists who had spent careers writing about Cadillacs and Camaros suddenly had something genuinely new to consider. Here was a car, a real car, not a kit, not a motorbike with a roof that a working American could buy outright, without a loan, without financial strain. In the first 12 months, more than 35,000 Yugos were sold in the United States. That's not a novelty figure. That's a legitimate market entry. For one brief year, Malcolm Bricklin looked like a genius. And then reality arrived, quietly at first, then very loudly. Electrical systems began failing, water pumps seized, timing belts, components that absolutely cannot fail without destroying the engine, were snapping well ahead of their expected lifespan. Rust appeared on bodies within the first year of ownership in wet climates. Replacement parts were difficult to find because the supply chain ran through a socialist country on the other side of the Atlantic. Consumer Reports magazine put the Yugo through its standard battery of tests and concluded, without diplomatic softening, that it was one of the worst vehicles they had ever evaluated. Owners who had bought in good faith found themselves trapped, cheap to buy, expensive to keep running. The jokes began almost immediately. Entire books of Yugo humor circulated. How do you double the value of a Yugo? Fill the tank. What do you call a Yugo at the top of a hill? A miracle. These weren't just cheap shots. They reflected a real frustration felt by tens of thousands of people who had trusted the promise. Now, before we get to the part of this story that nobody tells, if you're finding this as compelling as I do, take 1 second and subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell. You won't want to miss what comes next, because it gets much darker from here. Leave a comment below. What's the worst car you've ever owned or driven? And if you've got a friend who loves cars and history, send this to him right now. He'll thank you for it. Back to Yugoslavia. Because the jokes were one thing. What happened next was something the world was not prepared for. In November of 1988, a woman named Leslie Ann Pluhar was driving her Yugo across the Mackinac Bridge in Michigan, a 4-mile suspension bridge connecting the upper and lower peninsulas of the state. It was a severely windy day. Her car went over the side of the bridge and into the Straits of Mackinac below. She did not survive. The investigation that followed was thorough. Michigan State Police and the Bridge Authority both examined the evidence carefully. Their conclusion was that the extreme wind conditions, combined with the Yugo's exceptionally light weight, under 750 kilograms, had been contributing factors. The car was so light that it had become dangerous in conditions a heavier vehicle would have managed. The story landed in newspapers across America. It was the moment the Yugo's problem stopped being a punchline and became something more sobering. A car light enough to be compromised by wind was a car with a fundamental limitation that no price tag could excuse. Sales had already been declining before Mackinac. After Mackinac, they collapsed. Back inside Yugoslavia, the situation was deteriorating in ways that made car sales feel almost beside the point. The inflation that had been climbing through the mid-1980s was now out of control. In 1989, Yugoslavia recorded annual inflation of over 1,200%. People were losing their savings, not over years, but over weeks. The foreign debt Yugoslavia had accumulated during the relatively prosperous 1970s was now crushing. The International Monetary Fund was demanding austerity. The republics within Yugoslavia were increasingly looking at each other, not as partners, but as rivals for dwindling resources. Slobodan Milosevic had risen to power in Serbia in 1987, exploiting nationalist tensions in ways that were fundamentally reshaping the political landscape. Slovenia and Croatia were moving toward independence. The federation Tito had spent his life building was fracturing along lines he had spent decades trying to paper over. And through all of it, the Zastava factory kept producing cars, because those tens of thousands of jobs couldn't simply stop, because Kragujevac had no other industry to fall back on. Because halting the line would have been an admission that the entire project had gone wrong, and no one in power was willing to make that admission. The car meant to prove that Yugoslavia could compete with the world was now trapped inside a country struggling to hold itself together. And the worst chapter was still to come. In June of 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia. Within days, fighting had begun. The wars that followed over the next 4 years would claim the lives of over 100,000 people and displace millions more. They would redraw the map of Europe in ways that are still being felt today. For the Zastava factory, the consequences were immediate. International sanctions were imposed on what remained of Yugoslavia. Trade routes were severed. The export infrastructure Malcolm Bricklin had built dissolved almost overnight. The last Yugo was sold in the United States in 1992, not because the model had been discontinued, because the country that built it had become a place that Western businesses could no longer legally deal with. Workers at Zastava kept showing up, kept building. The domestic market still needed cars. People in Serbia still needed to get from one place to another. And the factory still needed to function not just economically, but as a point of psychological stability in a country that had very little left to hold on to. But in March of 1999, During the NATO military campaign over Kosovo, that stability was destroyed. NATO aircraft struck the Zastava factory in Kragujevac. The strikes were part of a broader campaign targeting Serbian infrastructure. Several factory buildings were destroyed. Production halted entirely. Workers stood outside the gates and watched the smoke rise from the buildings they had spent their careers inside. Some of them had been there for 20, 25 years. Their fathers had worked there before them. This was not merely a factory. It was the entire economic identity of a city. The images from Kragujevac in 1999 were striking not simply because of the scale of the destruction, but because of what the factory represented. It was the physical embodiment of a project national, socialist, deeply human reduced to rubble. The successor state of Serbia would eventually attempt to restart production. Limited output resumed in the early 2000s. But the market had moved on. The brand was effectively finished. In 2008, Zastava Automobiles ceased car production entirely. The last vehicle rolled off the line. The factory that had once employed 40,000 people quietly closed its automotive division for good. 40 years of production, millions of vehicles, an entire generation of working lives. Over. But here's what almost nobody talks about. And this is the part that should genuinely stay with you. The Yugo is remembered as a joke. Time magazine included it in its list of the 50 worst cars ever made. Automotive journalists still reach for it as shorthand for failure. Some of that criticism is fair. But reducing the Yugo entirely to a punchline means missing what it actually was and who built it. The engineers at Zastava were not incompetent. The workers on the line were not careless. Many of them were skilled, experienced people who took genuine pride in what they produced. They built cars under conditions that no Western factory ever faced: socialist production quotas, systemic pressure against stopping the line, supply chain limitations, a currency losing value by the week, and a government that needed the factory to succeed for reasons that had nothing to do with automotive engineering. The Yugo failed because of bad systems. Systems that rewarded quantity over quality. Systems where honest feedback was politically inconvenient. Systems where the gap between official success and factory floor reality grew wider every year until it could no longer be papered over. And here is the lesson that travels well beyond Yugoslavia and beyond the 1980s. Every institution, every organization, every government that prioritizes the appearance of success over the honest acknowledgement of failure eventually produces its own version of the Yugo. A product that looks adequate on paper, that serves the people at the top, and that lets down everyone at the bottom. The workers of Kragujevac deserved better. They deserved a system willing to stop the line when something was wrong, a system that valued their knowledge and experience, a system honest enough to say this isn't good enough yet. Let's fix it before it leaves this building. They never got that system, and in the end, it cost them everything. The Yugo today has a quiet cult following. Enthusiasts restore them. A handful sit in museums. There's something genuinely moving about that. The idea that a car once dismissed as worthless has found people willing to preserve it, to understand it on its own terms. Because underneath all the jokes, there is a human story. 40,000 families in one city, a country, trying to prove something to a world that wasn't listening. A car that crossed an ocean carrying the weight of a nation's ambitions. It couldn't carry that weight. Nothing could. But the people who built it were real. Their work was real. Their lives mattered. And their story deserves to be told honestly, not simply as a footnote to a punchline, but as a clear window into what happens when ordinary people are asked to serve extraordinary ideological ambitions, and what it costs them when those ambitions finally collapse. If this story hit differently than you expected, subscribe to this channel right now. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about the real cost of decisions made at the top and paid for by people at the bottom. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. Leave a comment. Did you ever see a Yugo on the road? Did you ever drive one? And if you've got a friend who thinks history is dry, send this to him. This is what history actually looks like.